I'll pin my video here for a second. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Katie. I am a librarian at the Lyon Township Public Library. You may see me do a little bit of pausing. That's to admit more people if more people join us tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about some housekeeping details. I am at home, so you may or may not see one of my pets. I have 2 cats and a dog. So I do apologize. I will be muted for part of the presentation. Feel free to use the chat function if you have any questions. If you've never used Zoom before, there's a little icon almost in the middle of your screen where it says chat, and there's a little speech bubble. So if you click on that, a little box should appear to the right of your Zoom window, and you can type in that any questions that you may have. I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this presentation from the Michigan chapter of the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, with Bill Konkolesky, and especially give a hearty thank you to Bill for taking the time to spend this evening with us. Before I turn it over to him, I just want to go over a few things. We are recording this Zoom event. We'll be spotlighting Bill, so he'll be the main image you see on your screen. Please keep your video off during Bill's talk. It just helps him focus, and he will take questions at the end. But you know, if something occurs to you while you're listening to him, feel free to type it into that Zoom chat box, and I'll make sure that Bill gets all of your questions in the order that you asked them. I will be monitoring the chat, so you may notice that if for some reason your audio comes on at any time, I will remute you. And then also I just want to let you know if there's anything disruptive during this Zoom meeting, whether through sound or video, it may result in your dismissal. And that's only because we want to make sure everyone can enjoy this shared event in a safe and comfortable online environment. So I also want to invite you to participate in our upcoming virtual events. We'll be closed next Tuesday for the general election, but we'll still be meeting virtually through Zoom for our monthly book club discussion. And this month's is the annual Community Reads Pick. So it's Kent Stage, the graphic novel by author Dirth Backdirth. And he'll also be visiting with us virtually on Thursday, November 12th at 7 p.m. So if you want to join in on that event, you just have to register for it on Novi Public Library's event calendar. But we have all of the information available in our event calendar on our website at www.ltpl.org. We're also welcoming back Detroit Institute of Arts docent Lynn for a talk on Vogue on Wednesday, November 4th at 6:30, and registration continues to be required for all events. Lastly, we welcome your feedback, if you don't mind, in the form of a short survey to share your experience with us. And after I'm done talking, I'll include that link in the little chat there. So you just take a moment of your time if you feel comfortable enough to give us some feedback. We just like to get your impression on how things are going and get some ideas for what you'd like to see in the future. So we take all of that into consideration when we're planning all of our virtual events. Now, without further ado, I have the privilege of hosting Bill a second time. I hosted him over at Southfield Public Library about a year or so ago, and I want to give him a hearty welcome. And Bill is the state director of the Michigan chapter of MUFON, and you can check out their website at mimufon.org. So that's mimufon.org.
Oh, thanks so much. Katie, I'm gonna start my screen share if that's doable.
Perfect.
Okay, and this one. And here we go. Boom. And one more time. There we go. Okay. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. The presentation that I'll be doing tonight is one that covers Michigan's biggest UFO sightings over the last roughly, I guess when I started doing this, I would say 50 years, but now it's closer to 70 years because we go back to the 1950s in this. There's been some really great, fantastic UFO sightings in Michigan, and not everybody knows about them, or at least not a lot about them. And I have been with MUFON now for about 27 years, and I've been state director now for 16 years. Actually, in January, it'll be 17 years that I'll be state director for Michigan. I've done bunches of presentations, and then I've contributed to some television programming. Um, I guess really the big reason I do this is I've gotten to the end of presentations before, and people have come in and said, you know, what is it that makes you knowledgeable about the UFO subject? So I'm like, okay, I'll put it up, and this is it. MUFON itself, though, is the big deal here. And before I get into the next slide, the Mutual UFO Network has been around since 1969. It's the world's largest UFO research, civilian UFO research organization. 40 countries, over 4,000 members, and you'll get to see just how many cases we get in just a second. Where I always like to start a conversation about the possibility of life in space is to go out into space itself and take a look at the odds for life out there. Right now, one estimate is that the Milky Way has about 300 billion stars in it, which is a lot. And it seems that, according to the data that Hubble and Kepler had brought in, that maybe 1 in 6 of these stars actually has a planet or moon orbiting it that might sustain life. And if you have 1 in 6 stars that have a potentially habitable planet or moon around it, and we have about 50 billion worlds then, and there's 300 billion stars in the galaxy, that means that there's about 50 billion worlds that may actually be capable of supporting life just in the Milky Way galaxy alone. 50 billion worlds in our galaxy might be able to hold life. That is a gigantic number. And to think that we're the only planet in the Milky Way with life on it becomes not as convincing with that many options out there. So let's make that number bigger. What you see in this picture are stars, but not just stars. These are galaxies of stars. These are whole galaxies, these little points of light on the screen. Every one of them is a separate galaxy. This picture taken by Hubble has been shared quite a bit over the number of years. But when you add it to the possibility that there might be so much life filling these galaxies, it really becomes astounding. Hubble was able to see about 100 billion galaxies out there. And if you think that possibly our galaxy is average with about 50 billion worlds on it that might sustain life, then you multiply 50 billion by 100 billion and you get 5 to the 21st power potentially life-sustaining worlds. That is a nearly unimaginable number of planets out there that might have life on them. Okay, if you're not impressed yet, let's take it even higher. Although Hubble could see only about 100 billion galaxies, the estimate from the data that we got in is that there's actually 2 trillion galaxies out there. 2 trillion galaxies. And if you got to think, if each of those galaxies only had 1 world in it that might have life, that's 2 trillion other worlds out there that could have life. But no, if you think maybe those galaxies are a lot like the Milky Way galaxy, if the Milky Way galaxy happens to be average, multiply that 2 trillion by 50 billion, and you have 1 to the 25th power potentially habitable planets or moons out there. So that is just an insane number of other worlds that might have life. And to say, well, yeah, but I see what you're saying, but maybe life just happened on Earth. Maybe I just think that's the case. It's really hard to argue with odds like this. So, admittedly, in walks this thing called Fermi's paradox. And it was put out there by a scientist who essentially said, okay, so you tell me there's all these possible worlds out there that might sustain life. If that's the case, then how come nobody's visiting Earth? Because you'd think that some of these civilizations would be more advanced, some of these planets would develop life that evolves into civilizations that are more advanced than us on Earth, and they would eventually find their way here to Earth. So where are they? And since they're not coming here, that's an interesting paradox, isn't it? Well, in the Mutual UFO Network, we say we are up to our necks in UFO sightings on a regular basis. And not all of them are anomalous, but enough of them are that, as the late Stanton Friedman says, really all you need is one, right? All you need is one good, solid, credible, believable UFO case, and that changes everything. And we have a lot more than just one. So in the upper right-hand corner, you have Dave McDonald. He is our current international director. He lives in Kentucky. And below him is Dan Aykroyd, probably our most famous MUFON member. He's done a lot of TV for us. MUFON, in fact, had its own TV series for a few seasons, and that was Hangar One that you see in the lower left-hand corner. And it's still available on, I think, a couple streaming services. I think it's on Netflix and Hulu currently, some of the reruns of that. And above that is an image from one of our annual conventions. Every year, MUFON has what it calls its International UFO Symposium. This year, it was supposed to be in Las Vegas, but due to COVID, we couldn't have it. So they just picked up and dropped the symposium into next year. So next July, it's supposed to be in Vegas. Details can be found at the MUFON International site, MUFON.com. So in the center here, we have our monthly MUFON journal. Contains some of our best sightings that come in, as well as some other interesting articles on the UFO phenomena, if you should wish to become a member of MUFON. Now about that number of UFO sightings that we get in. In our state chapter, you can see a 10-year total here from the last 10 years of 2,558 sighting reports into us. And these aren't things that we pull off the internet and like, oh, there's another one to put in our tally. No, every single one of these represents an individual coming to us, filling out a report form. And what's even more impressive, I think, is if you look at the 10-year total for our international, nearly 78,000 people over the last 10 years reported their UFO sightings to us. And I'm going to guess some of you haven't even heard of MUFON before. And yet we get that many sighting reports into us. In the parentheses, you can see that the great majority of cases that we get are from the United States, because other countries have their own homegrown UFO research organizations, even though MUFON does have some outreach around the world. And but still in the United States, over 60,000 cases reported to us in the last 10 years. All of these things all the numbers that you see here don't represent things we can't identify. In fact, about at least 85% of what you see on here, these numbers, are things that we have identified. We have an active group of investigators. For example, if you report your UFO sighting, you'll get contacted by somebody here in Michigan MUFON, and they'll investigate your sighting, and we'll determine whether we can figure it out what it was that you saw, or maybe we can't. So 85% is a low number. Sometimes we can get much higher in a given year, but that still remains, there still remains a tiny percentage of stuff we can't identify. So you're looking at like, well, what could account for this high number of sightings that are identifiable? Aircraft is a big one, of course, celestial objects. Sometimes like a comet or just a shooting star, or some people still actually report Venus, that sort of thing. They report Venus on occasion. But the thing about this is that there are trends sometimes in unidentified objects that we are able to identify. In 2012, you can see a jump up in our numbers up to 422. That's a pretty big jump. And that's because that year, Chinese lanterns or sky lanterns were all the rage. It was a big fad. Basically, you just get a little candle, plastic bag, and whoosh, there you go, a micro hot air balloon. And when you get these things, they were pretty cheap, available in stores all over the place when they were pretty hot item. You can get one for, I think it was a couple bucks, literally. And so why let up one when you can, for 10 bucks, you can let up 5 or 20, even more. And so when people would see these things in the sky, they would just see these silent glowing lights flickering in the sky. The witnesses that were reporting it to us, they would say, "Oh, it flew silently. It strobed. I got pictures. I got video. You know, I could see it for 5 minutes. All of this." And if you saw one of these, it's kind of weird. But if you see three of them, you could like connect the dots in your head and say, "Oh, wow, look, I think I'm seeing a triangle in the sky." That sort of thing. And so then after a while, we started to figure out what everyone was reporting to us, and people started to know what they were after they saw enough of them, and our sightings started to tick down again until 2015, where drones were the next big deal. And people, drones are easy. They have strange colored lights in weird places on them sometimes. And then you have the professional drone companies like Firefly drones here in Michigan that put on fantastic drone presentations. And it's easy to see why people started to think that these were UFOs, flying saucers, if you will, as well. And then people started to figure out what those were, and we started to identify them, and the numbers ticked down again. So this year, we already have over 200 sightings, and we've already blown past last year's 179 here in Michigan. And the big reason, and the numbers still climbing, and the reason for that is the new thing that everyone's seeing, which is Starlink satellites. Elon Musk, the head of SpaceX company, private space company. Elon Musk is also the Tesla Motors guy. And his dream is worldwide internet availability. And to achieve that, you send up a ton of satellites and boost Wi-Fi around the planet. If you're out in the middle of the ocean, Wi-Fi. If you're in Antarctica, Wi-Fi available because of these satellites. And he's already let up several hundred. I'm not sure if he's cleared 1,000 just yet, but there's a lot of these things up there. And when you see them, they're in a train. It's like a chain of lights flying through the sky. There's some good videos on YouTube if you choose to go there and look it up at some point, Starlink satellites. And his big goal is to have tens of thousands of these things in the sky to really boost internet. If you see something like a chain of lights in the sky, again, yeah, take a look to see if it's a Starlink satellites by looking at a good YouTube video. The situation that we have is about, really, I'm not even exaggerating, about a third of the cases that we got in this year are Starlink satellites. So yeah, but we keep on investigating, hoping for the good stuff, like what I'm about to present tonight. Some of the biggest, most interesting cases that Michigan has encountered. I start 1953, where it's called the Kinross incident, where a UFO allegedly collided with a jet fighter. And then 1966 was a massive year for UFO sightings here in Michigan. People still talk about it. 1975, a UFO came down over an Air Force base in northern Michigan. And then 1994 was the west coast of Michigan's big year for UFO sightings. And then I'll finish up with one of my favorite personal investigations, the one that impressed me the most. I might access a note or two as I go along, so I switch over to just my presentation, and then you see the little MUFON logo there. But we'll start off in the upper part of the state around the Sioux Locks. In 1953, the Korean War had just ended, and Kinross Air Force Base, which was up in the Upper Peninsula, was on high alert during the course of the war to see whether to guard against anything happening to the Sioux Locks. They felt that it would be possible for the North Koreans to somehow attack, sabotage the Sioux Locks, and put a dent in American shipping, and it would be damaging to our war effort if that was the case. So we had a base up there, and it had jet fighters. And this one day, November 23rd, 1953, they saw an unusual object appear on the radar at Kinross. This big circular object was clearly over the Sioux Locks, and nobody knew what it was. And so they scrambled a jet, an F-89 Scorpion, and when the jet started to approach the Sulaks, the radar return over the Sulaks shot over Lake Superior at a speed of about 500 miles an hour, very fast. Not, we had achieved that speed with our own aircraft prior to this, but nothing that fast, unidentifiable, should have been over the Sulaks at that time, clearly. So the jet flies out over Lake Superior to pursue it. They lose radar contact, radio contact with the jet fighter. And all they can see is the jet fighter get closer and closer to this mystery object on the radar. They see the UFO on the radar. They see the jet fighter. The jet fighter gets so close that at one point the signal return overlaps. The object and the jet fighter are in the same place at the same time on the radar, and when both of them blink out and disappear, gone forever. They never found the jet plane. They have no idea what the object was, except that it was larger than the plane, and nobody saw or heard anything again from the jet or the pilots on board. So the United States said, oh gosh, we got to come up with an excuse for this. And so they put out some story that the jet fighter was scrambled to investigate something that turned out to be a Canadian plane that flew too close. And Canada denied that story right away. And so the United States said, okay, geez, there went our sort of cover story that something happened and we don't know what to do about it. And the family of Felix Makla, the pilot, and Robert Wilson was the other person on board the plane. The family of Makla, when they heard the story, they thought, oh my gosh, he chased after a UFO and the UFO got him. And they put up a monument down in Louisiana where he's from. They put up this monument that said he disappeared intercepting a UFO. And the unfortunate thing about this incident is that the two guys were reported as missing in action rather than killed in action right away, because they really didn't know what happened to them. They couldn't find the wreckage of the plane. All they knew was that they were missing. So the family unfortunately didn't get the due benefits from them being reported as killed in action until the early 2000s when that got rectified. Now, this being an Air Force UFO sighting, it involved Project Blue Book. You might have heard of Project Blue Book. It was the Air Force's big UFO investigation effort. Went on 17 years. They investigated over 12,000 sightings. So Project Blue Book looks into the Kinross incident. And they went to the base, the Air Force base, and said, okay, what have you got to support that this is a UFO? And they said, well, we had this sighting here on our radar of this object. The plane went after it. They both disappeared. And they're like, okay, so you saw something on radar. Who around can tell us about what it actually looked like? But nobody could, because the only person that actually saw it, the only two were the guys on the plane, and they were gone. So the Air Force said, well, it sounds to us just that you had a faulty radar. And so, that's our determination. And what happened with the fighter and the two pilots aboard, well, who knows? But, you can't really claim, according to Blue Book, that has anything to do with the UFO phenomenon. Now, interestingly, the Air Force UFO accident report, the Air Force accident report, nothing to do with Blue Book, when they looked into it, they declared that the pilots were on a training mission and that Felix Makla must have had pilot vertigo and went down into Lake Superior. What they don't mention in the accident report is anything about a UFO. So you have one report that mentions a UFO as a bad radar, doesn't mention the pilots going down over the lake, into the lake possibly, and in another report that doesn't mention the UFO, just the pilots going down into the lake. So the two stories never really cross over. And so the story just sort of faded into history until 2006. A man by the name of Adam Jimenez, he said he was from the Great Lakes Dive Company. He claimed that they found the wreckage of both the F-89 and the UFO at the bottom of Lake Superior. And everyone got all excited, like, oh my gosh, they finally, found them, and this is great. And they said, if you want to find out more information, we'll be selling a DVD. Look for it sometime next year. What they didn't, what Jimenez, as he called himself, didn't take into account was that there were very active UFO investigation groups at that time. MUFON was one that uncovered in only just a matter of days that there was nobody named Adam Jimenez. There was no Great Lakes Dive Company. Both of these names were made up. And a whole bunch of other people in the UFO investigation community all jumped all over this too and said, where's any facts that are available on this? All they could find are hoaxed identities. And then the story disappeared instantly, just like the pilot had when it seemingly collided with the UFO. Moving next to Southeast Michigan, 1966. Often this particular sighting wave has some different nicknames to it. What I hear it called probably the most often, and it's kind of a quirky name for it, this is the big swamp gas wave of 1966. This particular sighting wave really started in 1965, really went to 1967, where there was heightened UFO activity in Southeast Michigan. But March of 1966 was really a big year, the whole spring of 1966, actually. And in particular, the week of March 14th to 21st had a few of the biggest nights of this phenomena. Starting off on March 14th in Ann Arbor, the people that were out late that night between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. were treated to this strange aerial show of these different colored glowing discs flying around in the sky doing just crazy acrobatic maneuvers. There were pink lights, there were blue lights, there were green lights dancing in the sky, and there were over 100 witnesses from the U of M campus and the surrounding area from the 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. area. And you think most people were probably, I mean, it's a college town still, but a lot of people obviously asleep at that time, yet still there were that many witnesses that came forth. Amongst the witnesses were sheriff's deputies, police officers, and sheriff's deputies from Livingston, Monroe, and Washtenaw counties. The Hillsdale Civil Defense Director also saw this. The big deal about police coming forth and seeing that they seeing UFOs is interesting in a couple different ways. One is that police are trained to be, they're trained observers. So whatever an officer sees when they arrive at the scene of an accident or a crime could hold a lot of weight in court. So they are conditioned to take in the details as accurately as they can. And the other thing is that they're trained to keep the peace. So it becomes interesting when the police come out and share some of their sightings. Also interesting is that Selfridge Air National Guard Base also admitted that it tracked UFOs that night, actually over Lake Erie. So what did the police say about this? Well, one of the witnesses, Washtenaw County Deputy Sheriff Buford Bushrow, said to the press, quote, "This is the strangest thing that we have ever witnessed. We would not have believed this story if we hadn't seen it with our own eyes. These objects can move at fantastic speeds, make very sharp turns, dive and climb and hover with great maneuverability. We have no idea what these objects were or where they could have come from. At 4:20 a.m., there were 4 of these objects flying in a line formation in a northwesterly direction. At 5:30, these objects went out of view and were not seen again." So what he could have said was nothing. What he could have said was, people saw some lights, we're looking into it. But what he said instead, really alarming how much detail he put out there publicly. And jumping ahead to March 20th, now people were seeing UFOs through the week. This wasn't just that it took a few more days to have more sightings. But March 20th is another big night in this particular week. There were at least 60 witnesses, including a dozen police, in the Ann Arbor area that observed multiple discs, including some of them, some of the witnesses claimed they saw a formation of 5 discs. Not only was there a formation of 5 discs, but one of them actually descended into a field in Dexter. And you have here a couple of the witnesses. The gentleman on the porch is Ronald Manor, and that's his father, Frank Manor, pointing in the photo. The UFO came down at the edge of their property in a field. Frank Manor here is speaking with J. Allen Hynek. J. Allen Hynek is the chief scientific advisor for Project Blue Book at the time. So Project Blue Book sent him out to the Ann Arbor, Dexter, etc. area to speak to these witnesses and make some sort of determination of what he was able to find out from them, what they saw. In this particular night, okay, Hynek hasn't arrived yet. He doesn't come into the picture yet. He's just talking to the witnesses after the fact in this photo. But that night of that sighting on March 20th, these 2 gentlemen, as well as some other family members in the house, were witnesses to the UFO landing. But with them were also Dexter Police Chief Robert Taylor, kind of a big deal. He's parked on the edge of their property. He sees the UFO come down. He drives his vehicle up to the edge of the property and parks his car, and he's watching the UFO in the field. Also, witnesses, Washtenaw County Sheriff's Deputy Stanley McFadden and David Fitzpatrick, 2 officers in a different vehicle in a different part of the property, are watching this thing. So the Manor family, as well as 3 people from law enforcement. What is up on the screen right now is the witness report taken from McFadden and Fitzpatrick from the Manor gentlemen. What they don't mention in this particular report was that they were also witnesses. They just focus on the Manor family. So while the police actually held back and watched us just observe this thing in the field, Frank and Ronald Manor decided to take a closer look. So they get out to a distance of several hundreds of yards already, and they can determine at that distance that it seems to be about car length. They described it as football shaped, had a rough pitted exterior on it, had glowing red lights around the edge, and it was kicking off this thick fog beneath it. And they got closer, and here's Frank and Ronald there in a recreation photo. And in the right here, that image is the actual spot where the UFO landed. I put a little Photoshop thing, UFO on top of it, but I went out to the sighting location myself, and the current owner of the home knew exactly where the UFO came down, led me and my group to it and was pointing to where it came down. He was not there. He's not related to the Manors at all. He just happens to be the current homeowner. And so when Frank and Ronald Manor approached it that night, Ronald said, "Look at that horrible thing." And when he said that, the UFO sped off instantly, and with this ricochet noise, it zoomed over McFadden and Fitzpatrick's car and kept going. Just flew off pretty much ground level and kept on trucking. Now, McFadden and Fitzpatrick didn't pursue it, but the police chief, Robert Taylor, did actually put out an APB, I guess you say, like, "Oh my gosh, there's this UFO flying around. Everybody, go look for it." And before I leave this, so just remember that if a UFO lands on your property, if you just give it an quick insult, it'll take off right away, apparently. Seemed to work in this case. So back to the UFO chase. Robert, like I said, Robert Taylor said, "Police cars, be on the lookout." And sure enough, some police cars did spot this thing on Island Lake Road. It ultimately led to 6 police cars chasing this thing. Here's Island Lake Road itself. And of course, the police cars never caught the thing. leading to the big night, in my opinion, the biggest night of sighting in this particular week, March 21st. It's about 10:30 p.m. at Hillsdale College in the women's dorm. Here in set is an image of several of the women. This was covered by CBS, if I remember correctly, on their news, and this is from that. 17 actually witnesses saw this thing, this disc-shaped object passed by their dorm. It had red and green and white pulsating lights on it. And one of the witnesses from the dorm, Gidget Cohn, remembered that it was in the news that the Hillsdale Civil Defense Director had also seen this thing earlier in the week. And so she calls him up and says, "Hey, remember that UFO you saw? Well, we're seeing a UFO right now. It just flew past our place." And he said, "Oh, okay, wow, that's great. You know, if you should ever see anything else like that again, please let me know. I'd be very interested." So a half hour later, they call Van Horn back up, Gidget does, and says, "Remember that UFO I mentioned a half hour ago?" And he's like, "Of course." He says, she says, "Well, it's back, and it landed on our baseball field here on campus." And so the baseball field's roughly about half hour from their dorm. And Van Horn says, "Okay, I'll be right out." He calls the police, tells them that the UFOs landed on the baseball field, or he tells them it's on campus. The part about him actually saying exactly where it is, I question, and I'll let you figure that one easily out in a second. But so he goes right to the dorm, and he is met by Kelly Hearn, who is the assistant dean, an assistant dean at the college, kind of the den mother for the dorm. And besides the two of them who were able to witness it from their dorm, 87 students were there watching this thing. So you have 89 witnesses to this UFO on the landed ball field. Now, the part about the police is every time they drove past the ball field, or anytime any car drove past the ball field, the UFO lights would turn off. As a police car or any other vehicle would drive by, the lights would go back on again. So the police never stopped, never really slowed down, nor did anybody else. It seemed like the only people that were really watching this thing were the people, all the witnesses in the women's dorm. And they watched, and then suddenly the object started to bob up and down slowly. And then this is kind of how it looked: a red light on one end, a white light on the other, had this sort of dome on the top. Again, a rough exterior, much like the manners described the previous evening. So the UFO starts to ascend, and then it just starts flitting about in the sky. It would appear, it would disappear here. It would disappear here, would reappear over there. And then it flew off into the sky in that sort of skipping motion, where it wasn't exactly flying. It seemed to be teleporting almost around the sky. And it flew off. So Van Horn says, "Oh my gosh, this thing landed. We might be able to get some good soil samples." The next day, they go out and take some samples from the ground. They didn't see any depressions, but they had a good estimate of where this thing came down. And they took it to the lab there at the college. And depending on whose version of the story you hear, either they were able to determine some really heightened radiation levels, or other people saying that they screwed up the test and that the evidence really isn't admissible. But what should be admissible is the fact that 89 people saw it come down. So Project Blue Book gets involved at this point, and J. Allen Hynek comes out pretty much right on the heels of this sighting, and his duty is to investigate and then go public to say that there was nothing of interest that anybody saw. He's supposed to come up with some explanation to dismiss what everybody was seeing. And we know this because when Project Blue Book closed, Hynek was very open about that. He was saying, "Yes, they told me under no, under no circumstances should I say that, well, maybe one or two people saw a legit UFO." No, he was to dismiss the whole thing. So March 25th at the Detroit Press Club, he puts on this press conference, and the press conference is still viewable on YouTube, or viewable now on YouTube is probably the way I should say that. But he said that, well, maybe what some of the people saw, especially that thing that came down in Dexter, maybe they saw swamp gas or marsh gas, something like that. And the press just went wild with it. You either saw the headlines back in the day, or you can imagine them saying, UFO, Air Force says UFOs nothing but swamp gas. And so when he said that, all the people all over Michigan were like, how dare the military lie to us? How dare the government lie to us? And what do you do? That old cliche, you write your congressman. So Gerald Ford was a Michigan congressman at the time, and he was getting calls and letters and visits and, the whole 9 yards. Excuse the football pun because he's a big football guy. But that people were saying, you have to do something. How can you, let this slide? And he's like, okay. So he writes this nice letter to the chairman of the Armed Service Committee and says, in the firm belief that the American public deserves a better explanation than that thus far given by the Air Force, I strongly recommend that there be a committee investigation of the UFO phenomena. I think we owe it to the people to establish credibility regarding UFOs and to produce the greatest possible enlightenment of the subject. Big, powerful letter. After this, never mentioned UFOs again. Certainly not when he was president. But his letter worked. The letter he wrote on March 28th turned into April 5th, fairly quick turnaround of a public hearing on the subject. So the Armed Services Committee hosts an open congressional hearing on UFOs on April 5th. And of course, they're going to call J. Allen Hynek in to testify. Now, Hynek was actually impressed by the sightings that people reported to him. He was already turning into a believer, is one way that you could put it, I suppose. But he was thinking, these people really saw something that is not explainable. And ironically, he was the one that went on TV and said swamp gas. So because of that, he felt really bad. He was just stinging with embarrassment. So he decides, hey, what can I do in this testimony that I'm about to give to, sort of save face? And he says, okay, people are unimpressed and dissatisfied with what the government says about UFOs, and also what the military says about UFOs. So my recommendation is there should be a civilian panel of scientists to review the UFO problem. And the Air Force says, that is a great idea. In fact, we'll put together that committee. So the Air Force, comically enough, puts together their own group to audit their UFO files. And that is, they went to the University of Colorado, and they got in touch with Edward Condon, who has government and military ties, no surprise. And they put together a study of the Air Force's Project Blue Book, even put out published their investigation. It's called The Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects, a book that is still available. You could go on Amazon to get it if you're interested. And here is Edward Condon sort of having a little giggle about a UFO on top of a stack of papers. So, of course, certainly there was no way that they were going to, that this group at University of Colorado was going to come out any other way than to say that there was nothing to the UFO phenomena, which is what the Air Force had been trying to do for so many years with Project Blue Book. But this gave them the opportunity. Ironically, J. Allen Hynek's testimony allowed them a way, an off-ramp from public UFO investigation. And so on December 17th, 1969, Blue Book says, we say there's nothing to the UFO phenomena. This outside civilian group says there's nothing to the UFO phenomena, so we're closing our doors. Though, out of the 12,618 cases they investigated, 701 of them still remain unidentified. And that's a really big number for Project Blue Book, who, if you remember from the Kinross incident, they were doing everything in their power to diminish anybody's perception that there was anything to this UFO phenomena. And to this day, whenever you sometimes hear people talk about UFOs and somebody will chuckle, oh, it's nothing but swamp gas, haha. So that was because of this very particular incident that happened here in Michigan, of course, making Michigan not only the Great Lakes state, but also the swamp gas state. Moving up now to Wurtsmith Air Force Base, 1975. On this particular night of October 30th, 1975, at about 10 o'clock p.m., a UFO came down over the base that was up here in northern Michigan that housed nuclear bombers until 1993. This base turned into a civilian airport after it was closed in 93, and somebody told me that they think it just closed down permanently as a civilian airport. Not sure about that, but back in 75, they had nuclear weapons, they had nuclear bombers, and an issue with a UFO, bright disc, circular disc, oh, that's redundant, comes down over the weapons storage area. And the guards of the weapons storage area are looking up at this thing and saying, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. And the air traffic tower can see it too. And they even caught it on radar. And so they weren't sure what they were going to do about the situation. So a plane is actually, just happens to be coincidentally coming in for a landing right when this thing is flying, hovering over the base. And this is a big honking KC-135 Stratotanker refueling plane coming in. It's nothing nimble or too menacing. It's a refueling plane. But the tower says to it, hey, you see that big bright light hovering over the base? And they're like, of course. They're like, can you just sort of fly up to it and see what it does? And so they had to follow orders, and they got closer to the light. The big disc lit up. And as they got closer, the disc shot south directly, and the base ordered the plane to follow it to see how far they could keep the light in view. And as they got closer to the shore, into the crux of the thumb, they lost the light and all the lights up on shore of the buildings, etc. And so then they turned around to head back to the base. And when they did so, the UFO flew back up to the plane, paced it for several moments, and then shot straight up into the air. Now, what's scarier than a UFO hovering over a base with nuclear weapons? How about 4 incidents of UFOs hovering over bases with nuclear weapons in a 2-week period? Wurtsmith was only the second out of 4 bases that encountered something like this. October 27th, just a few days before, at Loring Air Force Base in Maine, they had something identical happen. And then after October 30th here in Michigan, November 7th was Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana's turn, and then November 9th was Minot Air Force Base's turn in North Dakota. All of these bases had nuclear weapons. All of them reported a big white glowing disc descend on their bases. In fact, this was not Malmstrom or Minot's first time being visited by UFOs either. They've had much more dramatic encounters with UFOs in previous years during the 1960s, but the UFOs came back to revisit those bases and Wurtsmith in this case, as well as Loring Air Force Base. Kind of a scary pattern. Moving over to the Grand Rapids area. At this time, people were seeing UFOs at a level in Michigan that hadn't been encountered since 1966. Like the 1966 sightings, people were having sightings before March and after March of that particular year, but March was the big month for the sightings. Much like the 1966 sightings, people were seeing glowing discs in different colors, doing wild maneuvers. And in this case, too, they were seeing a lot more formation style flying of these things. besides these individual glowing discs, people also saw very large discs with glowing lights around them as well. Here is sort of the thumbprint area of people having reported UFO sightings during this sighting wave. Muskegon, Grand Haven, Holland, this whole general area. And for this particular sighting wave, there was one night that really took the cake, which was March 8th, 1994. There were over 300 witnesses recorded to UFOs in this general area that particular night. There were several calls to 911. If you go out on the internet, you could probably find the transcripts of a lot of these calls. Also, the audio to several of these calls is available on YouTube. I think you want to look up Ottawa County UFO. I think that'll pull up the sighting audio. And so there were tons of calls to 911. So the police were very inundated with UFO sightings that night. Now, when it comes to pictures and video, because of course you would think, well, somebody must have got this thing on film. I've seen some pictures, I've seen some video, and really what you see in a picture is a black, imagine a completely black background with a single white dot in the middle. Or the video is a big black background with a tiny white light kind of zigzagging around, and you don't know if the object itself, the light, is zigzagging around, or if the person just can't hold their camera straight. But really inconclusive photo and video, unfortunately, despite some really dramatic sightings. Now, this was such a big deal that in the press that it actually made it to the Detroit News and Free Press. This is front page. And here is the witnesses that really became known as the big witnesses to this event. A family of 4. You don't see the father, Daryl, in this picture, but the rest of the family is here. Holly Graves, and then their kids, Joey's 14, Michelle is 10. And the Graves family here all saw, the 4 of them, this big, giant disc outside their backyard with glowing lights all over it. Here is sort of what they described it. They described it as Christmas tree lights. These are the actual sketches from the family. And the family members here all were in agreement, and then they called 911. And the police were very interested to hear their story. They're like, the UFO is still there. It's not going anywhere. Good. We've been getting calls like crazy. We're going to send an officer out to do a firsthand investigation. So Officer Jeff Veldhaus comes out to the Graves house, family house. You can see Graves family is listed on that little box up at the top. That's where they were. And so he goes out there and he's got binoculars. He talks to the family while he's looking at this thing, and he sees that there's not only just one of them, there's actually a second one behind it. He's seen 2 of these things. 2 giant discs with multicolored glowing lights all around them. And while he's watching it and talking to him, the object flies overhead and shoots down the street and keeps going. So this is Veldhaus's actual map that he drew for MUFON, and I put the red line on there to highlight the path of the UFO. So he gets in his car and he is following it. And then the police are like, okay, well, we have one of our own officers watching this thing, even following it now. Where do we go from here? How about anybody local that might have a good radar? And they reach out to the National Weather Service. And they get a radar operator, and they're like, hey, are you seeing anything on your radar that looks out of place? And he says, I very much am. He says, I'm seeing 3 objects on my radar that I can't explain. He says, our radar isn't built to detect aircraft. It's built to detect pinpricks. It's built to detect weather, to pick up weather. And when planes are seen, they're depicted as little pinpricks on the radar, and they disappear pretty quickly. But he goes, these 3 objects, he goes, they're about thumbnail sized, and they are just kind of floating around the area. They're not really going anywhere. And he goes, I have no idea what they are. And then after observing them a while, the objects shot west over Lake Michigan. The radar operator spotted it exactly as at the same time as Officer Jeff Feldhaus did. And the estimated speed, it was about 3,000 miles an hour that these things shot out over Lake Michigan. Nobody in Indiana or Wisconsin or Illinois reported anything. It's as if they disappeared over the lake. Who knows if they went up or down or just vanished, but they didn't fly across the lake and keep going. They disappeared over the lake. At one point, the the press of this thing got really big. I have a collection of clippings about this particular sighting wave, which is very large. It, of course, drew the attention of UFO investigators from all over the place. So MUFON had a heavy investigative team researching this particular event, as well as the Center for UFO Studies. The Center for UFO Studies is the group that was founded by J. Allen Hynek once he left Project Blue Book. He was convinced that there was something to the UFO phenomena and that a serious investigation should be done after Project Blue Book closed. He creates a group called the Center for UFO Studies. It's headquartered out of Chicago. And one of their investigators, Dr. Michael Swords, professor at Western Michigan University, volunteers to go out and investigate the sightings himself. He gets in touch with Jack Bushong, the radar operator, and asks him, hey, do you have radar data from that particular night? And he says that they don't. They don't generally record, save their radar data. You know, it's not, weather's just not that big of a deal, apparently. So he says, Sword says, well, can we do this? Can we maybe come up with some sketches of what you saw? And Bushong says, okay, let me check with my superiors. So he does, and he gets back to Swords and says, okay, yeah, we can do some sketches on one condition. The National Weather Service gets one copy, the Center for UFO Studies gets one copy, and nobody else ever sees these sketches ever. And both sides agree, that's fair, let's do this. So here are the sketches. And I put red dots over the UFOs in the picture in the sketches, the series of 9 sketches, to highlight where they are. At one point there are, I'm going to play it again. At one point there's even 4 of these things seen. And wherever you see sort of a jagged line is where there was not a clear return, but something was there. So one more time, UFOs flying over the southwest part of the state, disappearing over Lake Michigan and not coming back on the other side. So if you remember the deal, National Weather Service gets one copy, Center for UFO Studies gets one copy of these sketches and nobody else sees them. So you might think, well, you know, the Center for UFO Studies, they really just couldn't hold on to this information. They just had to get it out or something like that. But no, somebody did a Freedom of Information Act on the National Weather Service to release these sketches, and they did. So who knew you could do a Freedom of Information Act on the National Weather Service? All it took was 2 weeks after these sketches were first created for the sketches to be released. So another big sighting on the other part of the state. And I'll wrap up here with the sighting that I investigated that left the biggest impression on me personally. This happened in 2004, the sighting. And the gentleman who made this sighting report said that he actually had 2 events, one on September 29th and the next day on September 30th. He called me in March of 2005 and told me about what happened to him, what he saw in September 2004. So this is 6 months after, roughly 6 months after he had had his sighting that he calls. And still after 6 months, he's very shaken up. He's very upset. He's in a really bad place about it. And and he is really anxious to talk to somebody. So me and a couple field investigator trainees show up at his home to interview him. And the first thing he describes is what happened to him on the night of September 29th at about 10 p.m. He's driving on, I believe the name of the road is Hickory Ridge, and the road has a little curve to it, a couple curves. And at one point when he's rounding one of these curves, he finds himself suddenly under this giant triangle in the sky. Said that it was gigantic. It had a red light in the center of the bottom and white lights at each of the vertices, and that it blanked out the stars. It blocked out the stars behind it, so he knew it was a solid object. Just hovering silently over the road, he speeds past it and keeps going and drives straight home. And he says that the object was about the size of a football stadium. That's how big he said it was. So absolutely massive. So he gets home, certainly panicking, having a rough time of it. And before we get back to him the next day, this also happened that late that night and into the early morning the next day. People were seeing UFOs around Detroit Metro Airport. They were seeing strobing lights zipping all over the sky and doing a sort of a teleport jump, much like described in that 1966 March 21st event. The people that were seeing this were people that live and work in this area, and they know what normal air traffic looks like and knew that this was not what they were seeing. Most of the sightings occurred in the general area of where 94 and 275 meet up. So on Dick Burton's morning show that day, somebody calls in and says, "Oh my gosh, I saw these UFOs last night. Did anybody else see these UFOs?" So Dick Burton says, "Oh, wow, this is fascinating. Hey, if somebody else saw these UFOs last night, please call in." Sure enough, 2 more people call in saying that they saw them as well. Dick Burton decides to call the airport, which is, of course, right there. And I'm not sure who he got a hold of, but he asked, did anybody there see anything? Any reports come into them? No and no. And he asked, is it possible that something was caught on radar? To which he got the surprising reply that the person said that their radar doesn't go that far. So here's the airport. Here's where 275 and 94 meet up, and they're saying their radar doesn't go that far. So if you were never afraid to fly before, this certainly gives you reason to be afraid to fly. So going back to our witness who had seen the big triangular UFO a few hours before this, it's the next day, 3 p.m. in the afternoon. He's waking up from a nap on the second floor of his house in his bedroom. He looks out the window and sees what looks like a car driving over the tops of his trees at the edge of his property. And he takes a closer look, sees that there are no wheels on this car. It's a flying car. It's not actually touching the trees. And it's this black wedge-shaped object. It's about the size of a car. It's got these 3 portholes on it, but what in the heck is it? So he watches it until he can't see it anymore. And this lights his panic attack back up. And it took him several minutes to calm down and gather up enough strength to go downstairs into his kitchen. And when he makes it down to his kitchen, it's landed in his backyard, or one just like it, because he did lose sight of it. So this thing, he said, was parked right outside of his window for an hour. When I asked him the obvious questions, did you call anybody? And he's like, no. He's like, after it was there for several minutes, I thought maybe it was stuck there. Like maybe it needed to refuel or do some repairs or who knows what. And he said, if it thought that I was calling for reinforcements, if you will, he said, who knows what would have happened to me. Like, okay, did you take a picture of it? And he's like, no, for all I know, if I held a camera up or whatever, he would think that I had a weapon. And so I said, okay, so what did you do? He's like, I sat and I watched it for an hour. And then after an hour, it got up and did a 45, cocked up a 45-degree angle and flew out through the trees and disappeared. I drew the sketch on a napkin. I did do that. And that's what I used to base my image of here is his napkin sketch. And we brought our, what I like to call our antique radiation detection equipment. And we went outside in the backyard. But the problem is when we got there in March, there was a foot of snow on the ground. And 6 months later, with all that snow, no, we're not going to detect any sort of radiation in his backyard. And in fact, we have no idea if there were any depressions in the ground where this thing landed. And so I volunteered to him. I said, hey, maybe we could come back in a couple of months and see if there's any depressions on the ground or any other physical evidence. And he's like, no. He's like, I invited you out here to get this off my chest, and now it's your problem. He was very just like, I'm dumping this on you. And still wondered why he was so, I mean, this is enough to rattle anybody, right? But 6 months later, then he's still in really bad shape. And then he shares the final detail with us before we left. And that is, he said that within the portholes, there was this glowing red light and this mist. And he saw this little childlike form, is how he described it, moving around inside the red mist. So he saw an occupant of this thing moving around. It wasn't just an object back there, that something was in this craft, and it seemed to know he was watching it. And that really, really rattled him. And that was something that really stuck with me, just the honesty, the credibility, how badly it messed him up. This was something that really seriously affected him. And with regards to what he saw, this black wedge-shaped craft with the portholes, having been doing UFO investigations for a while, I'd never heard of another craft that looked exactly like that. That is until a few years later, 2008, a Michigan truck driver reports this object that he saw when he was driving in Oklahoma. He said it was black, wedge-shaped, had 3 portholes, and it was pacing his truck as he was driving through Oklahoma. On the expressway he was on, as the expressway took a turn, the object kept flying straight until he lost sight of it. The only real significant difference between what the one gentleman saw, roughly, and this, in my opinion, is that the portholes on it were square in this case rather than round. Is that meaningful? I don't know. Sometimes Jeeps have round headlights. Sometimes they have square headlights. It could be, I guess excuse a little levity. It could be a different model year for them. I don't know. But yeah, it really gave me the chills when I saw this sketch here from the witness who saw this in 2008. And besides all the sightings that I shared with you tonight, some of the big ones, sightings keep coming. People report UFOs here in Michigan once or twice a week, which is a pretty steady number. Again, not all of them are anomalous, but enough of them are to keep things interesting. And people ask, oh, is there a time of year where we see more UFO reports? There is the slightest jump in sightings around the 4th of July, but really it's steady, understandably, around the 4th of July, but really otherwise it's steady all year. There isn't a particular time outside of a couple big events like we saw in 1966 or 94. Otherwise it's steady. And people always say, well, where is the UFO hotspot? Where are people seeing UFOs regularly in Michigan? And the fact is, well, wherever there's more people report UFOs. We have this software called UFO Stalker, and one of the things where you could look up UFO sighting areas in the software, and one of the things you could do is ask it to give you the last 100 UFO sightings for your state. And when you do this, it's always a population map. So it's not a case of somebody out in the middle of nowhere possibly got some sort of issues seeing these sort of things. No, it's people all over the place all the time seeing these things. We used to be able to ask it to give us 1,000 sightings, last 1,000 sightings. And when you did that, you always could see, you could also see, I should say, I-94 and I-75 on the map. It really is that dramatic. And wherever you see a triangle on this particular map, if you're curious, that's a triangular UFO sighting. And anything else is either a disc or a light or something else. But bringing back Fermi's paradox, to those who say, well, if there's life out there in space, how come we're not seeing it here? Well, like I said, we're up to our necks in UFO sightings all the time. It never lets up. I think the evidence is not only there, but it's ridiculously overwhelming that something is happening here. And the real crazy thing is ignoring that something is happening. I would like to invite you, if you have seen a UFO, to please report it to MUFON.com. If you would like to be somebody who investigates UFOs, you could learn how to investigate UFOs with us at MUFON.com. Our state chapter is Michigan. MUFON's site here is MI for Michigan, MUFON.org. And when you go to that site, you can find out more about our state chapter, including upcoming meetings that we have. Our next meeting is, in fact, November 15th. It's a Sunday, and it's a free meeting to attend. If you want to check us out, please just drop in as well. Information on how to get to the meeting will be at the website, and just follow the directions there. And I will stop my screen share. And so thanks so very much. If anybody has any questions or comments or wants to talk about a sighting that they may have had, this would be a great time to do that.
Yeah, feel free to request to be unmuted or to use the raise your hand little option. It should be around the chat area. But I did have a question for you, Bill. Have you ever seen a UFO?
Yeah, well, what got me into MUFON was a sighting that I had. The first thing I reported to them was a sighting I had in 1989. Me and two friends were parked in my buddy's Chevette, the three of us in the car at 9 o'clock waiting for another friend to get off of work. And while we were parked there, at the height of like 2 telephone poles, this blue ball of light did this tumbling, arcing move over the sky directly above us. It's just bright blue egg-shaped light. And then after it did that, then this white light came and zigzagged all over the sky, and that disappeared. And then a red light appeared in the middle of the sky and grew really big and then shrank and disappeared. The next day I went into, I'm getting ahead of myself because we were trying to figure out what to do at that moment. One of my two friends said, hey, maybe we should tell the police. And we were high school seniors at the time. So we didn't quite have the courage to, as high school seniors, to tell the police that we saw a UFO. And so my other friend says, well, then maybe we should tell Selfridge. And I'm like, yeah, okay, so we're not going to tell the police, but we're going to tell the military? Are you going to be the one that makes that phone call? And, he's like, oh, yeah, good point. And then the next day I went into work and I went up to one of my coworkers that say, hey, you never guess what I saw last night. And she's like, oh, did you see the UFO? I was like, huh? And she goes, the maintenance guy said he saw this blue UFO in the sky last night. So I went to him and yeah, he told me his story before I could tell him mine. And he only saw a blue UFO, but yeah, he said it was zigzagging down his street the previous night. So that really impressed me. And I still didn't know who to tell. And years later, I found out about the Center for UFO Studies. I went to their office in Chicago because I was already visiting a friend there. And I met with Dr. Mark Rodiger and he said, why are you telling us this? How come you're not telling your state MUFON chapter? I'm like, MUFON, what's that? So he gave me the number of the state director at the time, a woman by the name of Shirley Coyne. I come back to Michigan and contact her, and she was very receptive to that. And I told her about some of the other unusual things I'd seen in life. And yeah, I've been on board, excuse the pun, ever since that, and that was 93.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that, Bill. Did anyone have any questions or want to share an experience of your own?
And that's okay if nobody else has anything to say. It is a out there topic, and so nobody has anything specific. It's all good.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. I did include the link to our program survey feedback form, so it should take you to a Google Doc. It doesn't take that long to fill it out, so if you wouldn't mind doing that for us, it just really helps us out with future planning. But I want to thank Bill again for joining us tonight and sharing all that information, and thank you for attending. So thank you, everybody. And if there are no questions, then I'll just go ahead and end the meeting here in a little bit, but I'll wait and see if there are any questions or comments. All right, well, I don't see
So,
anything, so
yeah,
I'm going
thanks
to
so
call it
much.
a good night.
Yeah,
So
thank you,
everyone
thank you.
enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, Bill.
Yep, far out.